Hey there, and welcome to the first episode of Work Dope, a podcast on the messiness and the potential of work life. I'm Linda Stacy, and I'm a corporate sellout who likes to think of herself as a corporate innovator. I think that working in corporate America doesn't have to suck, but it often does. By some stats, up to 80% of the workforce is really unsatisfied and just not happy at work. And on the flip side of this, or kind of the paradox here, is that more and more of us are looking for work to kind of serve as our identity and fill our needs and our sense of purpose in the world. So the pandemic and the Great Resignation, all of these things have kind of forced us to look at, quality of life inside and outside of work. What does culture really mean? There are so many issues about the human side of work and what can be addressed right head on and what can't be and what we aren't talking about still and what we need to talk about more of so that people can really thrive. There's so much potential and so much still that is living inside of fear and scarcity mindset. I do want to say, though, that I think that business is really cool. I think that building things and creating things is one of the hallmarks of being human. It's a fantastic aspect of the human experience, and building businesses is just one way to totally embrace and manifest human potential. I want to say a few things about this first recording. Stay with it. I'm setting out a bunch of premises, a bunch of things that, I'll be diving into later as I bring in guests and I have other solo episodes. But it's hard to know sometimes where to get started. So as it goes past the first few minutes, it begins to come together more and gels more. So please stick with it. Listen to the entire recording. Wait for it. Another thing I want to say is that I mentioned my email address as it relates to the podcast, and I said it wrong one time. I said it correctly the first couple of times, but I said it wrong. So I just wanted to spell it out here too, that it's Linda@workdopepod.com. So it's WORKDOPEPOD.com, workdopepod.com. So that's just a little correction there. And I also want to mention there's some cursing in this episode. So if you don't want to hear it or if you have kids around, you have been forewarned. Enjoy the episode. Hi there. This is Linda Stacy. Welcome to Work Dope, this podcast that's been in the works for a long time. My name is Linda Stacy. This is Work Dope. You might know me from Living Blueprints. And if you don't, I'm going to say a little bit about Living Blueprints, which is the business that I had that has led me now to this podcast space. So Work Dope is all about the messy underbelly of work, like the human side of work that a lot of people won't talk about openly at work, but maybe, gossip, water cooler stuff, something is going on, someone's pissed someone off. And I'm really going at this from maybe the lower ranks in the organization, people who are in support functions, people who might feel less supported. But this isn't just about the messy side of work. This is more about identifying it and then looking for ways to evolve right within it, not by just leaving or bailing on the corporate scene, but understanding how we can actually work differently and elevate no matter who we are, no matter what position we are in order to have a more effective, improved experience of the workplace. I think a lot of times I've experienced anyway, emotions around blame and being stuck or reacting to people or just having a scarcity mindset. A lot of judgment, a lot of victim mentality, a lot of procrastination, a lot of fear in these environments. And I really want to get to the cool side, the side actually that I see more in the people who are actually the rainmakers, the people who are on the business development side of the work or really in the thick of what the problem solving, whatever the company does. Those people tend to be much more into the action side, the solution side, the acceptance of the discomfort and working through things and results oriented. And they're responding, they're not reacting, they're taking responsibility. They have a very, very choice oriented perspective on where they're moving, even though their world is difficult too. This is all about elevating to bring to the other side of all of this. So in this first episode, I'm going to be talking about a lot of things. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to be talking a lot about the premise, about my background, what the podcast is for. It's going to evolve too. There's going to be so much discovery on my part. I've got a lot of shit to work through. I don't know all the answers. I am not a social scientist. I am not a certified coach. I am someone who's done a heck of a lot of observation. I'm the youngest of four. I was always very justice and fairness for all oriented as a result of kind of being the baby and feeling like I had no voice in the organization of the family, if you will. So, again, this is about discovery for everyone. I read a ton. I'm going to be reflecting a lot about what I read and studies that have been done. And I'm going to get people on, people who I know in my world right now as experts. And as this continues to go, it is absolutely my intention to bring in people that I read about, that I respect, that, have huge followings, and working towards that. So, again, today I'm going to be describing a little bit about, my vision for the at-work guidance counselor. I'm going to talk about what that means to me, a little bit about my background. I'm going to give a couple of stories, about, the bullshit that happens at work, kind of insidious behavior that people get away with, leaves people often in lower positions, not just lower positions, with, fewer options, very much in a victim state. So I'm going to give a couple examples of what I'm talking about there. I'm also just going to touch on how we all bring a different thing to work. We all have different background and, the diversity of experience and how that affects how we interpret everything that's happening at work. And just really, all of this kind of sheds light on the paradox of experience. And so maybe a little bit on that, and then what you might expect for future episodes. And really, as I describe all these premises, that it's really, an example of a sense of the highlights of where I can dive in further, where we can dive in further. I also want to share that as we go, you might have some interesting stories to share that you want to share, and I would love to be able to air them. So the initial idea is to have you record on your phone. So use some kind of recording app on your phone and then send me the recording to email. So the email for this podcast is linda@workdopepod.com. So WORKDOPEPOD.com. So linda@workdope.com for anything that you are like, oh my God, I have to share my story. I totally have an experience that other people would resonate with. And, maybe we discover what that was all about, or ways we could have worked within it. And again, I'll be dripping this in. I just wanted to get that word out so that you know that you have an opportunity for voice here as well. So again, all about the sticky underbelly of work and getting to the other side of the underbelly, to the positive things that I really do believe can happen in corporate. I really feel like we are on the verge of kind of like a Me Too movement in corporate. And some of Me Too movement happened in corporate, but really like expanding to raise awareness on all levels of what is actually happening in these places. So again, my name is Linda Stacy, and Living Blueprints, which is the company, the business that I had been working on maybe for the last 6 or 7 years. 2012 is when the idea was born. However, getting it off, the ground took a little bit longer. Again, I wanted to say that I am not a social scientist. I have read a ton. I'm also not a counselor. I am not certified in any type of training. I have been working in corporate America for more than 20 years. As mentioned before, I'm the youngest of 4. I've been observant my entire life, keenly aware of what's not fair in the world, although I've evolved to the point to realize that there's kind of some folly in looking at things through this lens all of the time. But that'll probably be an episode in itself. I'm all about social justice at work. Again, realizing that social justice might not mean like equity. It might not, the word fair is kind of limiting in some ways. So there'll be a lot of studies that I will refer to that will probably validate this human experience. There was a time I was listening to Dax Shepard, one of my favorite podcast hosts, talking to Adam Grant, and Dax was making a joke because Adam has like all of this fancy social science terminology for the things that Dax just talks about because he experiences it in his life. And I've often felt that way about social studies and, scientific reflections of the human experience. So I will reference these things, but I am not jazzed about creating my own studies myself or having to over-validate everything that is said and shared. This is discovery. There'll be opinion in here. I'm going to make statements that probably sound like blanket statements, but I realize there is no one statement that fits every experience or every human. And I just really often surprised by how often I'll be reading something that reflects a study and I'm like, yeah, okay, we already knew that just from being alive, right? And at the end of the day, we really can't argue with human experience. I think a lot of times these studies are written to convince people that they need to do something about it. And we're trying to convince people that maybe have the power or the money to make something happen. So I understand the point of the studies, but I find it, I don't know why. I find it very confining. Maybe I'll learn that about myself over time too. So I mentioned this theme around a workplace guidance counselor. When you were in school, hopefully you had someone who you could go to. If you were having a problem with a teacher, or you were having, maybe something was happening at home that was limiting your ability to navigate effectively at school, so it's going to affect your future. And the role of the guidance counselor was really to be able to help walk you through that. Someone with wisdom and training who could help you see what was happening on the other side, maybe, and help to bring resolution and tips and guidance for an individual to feel more empowered in their space. I don't think this exists right now in the workplace. And I think a lot of people stay in victim mode because in my experience, and this is who I was at another time in my life, and I still revert back to this when I'm kind of in my shadow state. Depending on how you were brought up, you might not really feel like you have the agency or even know that that's an option, that there are ways to kind of bring yourself forward in a situation. So HR exists, and there are often even coaches within the HR environment. And I have friends that are in HR, and I respect what HR does, but I don't think that HR really serves this role that I'm describing as counselor. I think that HR is obligated to the executive, the company above them and not necessarily below them. And that has been my experience. And I mean, my working experience has been that. And I am so driven to have people here to demonstrate how that opposite of that is happening in their organization. And I don't want to listen to necessarily, I will listen to the HR practitioners talk about that. I want to hear the front lines in their organization talk about that, like what it actually feels like to be in a place where there is more voice or a space to kind of be self-empowered in the work environment. Again, I'm going to get to a couple of examples of these insidious BS type things that happen. So we've all had experience of something at work getting a rise out of us. Sometimes we'll have an emotional reaction and maybe we don't even know what happened. We just kind of feel our blood boil. We know that we're upset and we almost can't really put a pin in it in terms of identifying what it is. And having language around these issues is important. And Brené Brown actually talks about this in her most recent book, which I'll reference later. I don't have it written down here, but she surveyed over 7,000 people about emotions and, what emotions they experience on a day-to-day basis. And the results ended up pointing to the fact that most people really only identify 3 emotions. And it was, happiness, anger, and sadness. It was very, very limited. And there's so much more range of emotion that's happening. And again, we need to get clarity around this in order to be more vocal and more action-oriented about what's really happening in the workplace. So this is one of the themes that I want to dig into at some point. I've heard friends of mine say over the course of my career in life, and even, when I worked in restaurants before I had, quote unquote, real jobs, so often I would hear a woman say about another woman, she just hates me. And it just grated at me. I felt really badly about the fact that women just feel this way about each other, that they can't get beyond it. They can't understand. Usually they would be talking about a boss or someone that had some control over them. And bosses often don't get a lot of training on how to work with humans, and it's all very, very complicated. But getting better language around these things is something that I hope to get at through the effort with Work Dope. Again, it's all around exploration and discovering and how we can be more thoughtful, reflective, expressive, and creative, and to know when and how to take more responsibility for what's actually happening and not stay in blame and victim state. More responsibility, more reflection, more detachment maybe, in order that we can actually be happier and not ruminate. At the end of the day, we all, no matter who we are on the planet, we have control over three things: our actions, our reactions, and our mindset. And the more that we can broaden the way that we think, the more we can actually harness these areas of control and be happier. And again, I use even the word happy is a little loose around this. Maybe I should say satisfied or fulfilled or in alignment or something like that, because I don't think we're meant to be happy 100% of the times. Emotions have purpose, all of them. And again, these are all fantastic things to talk about as we go through the podcast. I wanted to talk briefly about this living blueprints thing that I'm referring to, what led me to the podcast ultimately. Again, I found myself in a career where things were getting more and more demanding in my day-to-day, especially in the support functional type of role that I have been in for my entire career. It's a very reactive, very response-driven type of role, and just feeling really tired and exhausted at the end of the day. Like I hadn't really created anything or felt innovated or energized by any aspect of the work. Plus work life at home had gotten more complicated because I got married. I moved further away. Before I had lived working in Boston, living in Cambridge. Most people know that those are very adjacent cities. Literally 4 miles, but by the way that the train would go, it would take me at least 30 to 40 minutes to get into the office before I got married. After I got married, that changed to 90 minutes. So, all of my free time was just zapped. And again, just tired all the time and really cranky and irritable and resentful. And I just didn't want to be like that. So I was seeking any tool I could to have a better experience of my day-to-day. Again, I feel like I got some lesson somewhere that, you don't just bail, you don't just escape. And there's a lot of reasons sometimes to stay and figure it out inside the discomfort. And that's another theme that we'll probably be talking about, because sometimes, yes, it's appropriate to leave and get out of a situation. Other times it's an opportunity, most times, all times, it's an opportunity for growth and evolution. So Living Blueprints was founded on this idea where I was finding and creating solutions within my very complicated experience, my lack of satisfaction experience. I saw this as a big gap, especially in support for people in the front lines, if you will, or these support functions within organizations. Just, again, lack of support. There are books out there, but a lot of times the books and the advice and the gurus, they're not really speaking to the day-to-day experience of people in roles like mine. So I was doing speaking and workshops, and I wrote a couple of books, and really looking to bring this into businesses, to have it replace my income, really. But here's the deal. At the end of the day, it was becoming like incongruent with my actual goal and where my heart was in it, and my soul was, and it was to help the people on the front lines. And all the convincing that was required of the people who could pay for that. So if someone was going to bring me in for a workshop, that means I really had to speak to whatever HR had on their agenda or whatever the execs had on their agenda. And I'm not against speaking to that, but the way that I wanted to address these things was very, very transparent. And I think we still can't be so transparent in corporate. Again, I'm going to give a couple of examples in a second. And it felt I was handcuffed in that. I didn't want to convince people of what was happening to their people on the front lines. I just wanted to speak to the people on the front lines who are experiencing it and give them tools and solutions. And so thank goodness for the podcast platform, which is what I'm intending to do here. That is what this is for. Me going straight to the people who need these solutions. Whether or not your boss or your organization thinks you need it, it no longer matters, right? Just go straight to the source and keep your job that pays you well, pays your benefits, and have though a better experience of it all. And side point about this, I'm going to be talking about a lot that I respect the fuck out of business. The people that go out and start a company and are actually successful, I mean, it's at least 80%, if not more, of businesses that fail by year 5, and by 10, even more than that. It is very difficult to get a business off the ground. And the people who have done that and created an organization that can pay me what they pay me, plus my benefits, and provide work, that can be interesting as long as I'm willing to engage myself in a way that is appropriate. That is a huge gift to a lot of the world. And I think it's not fully recognized or understood what business creators have done. And I want to read something because my dad went into business a few different times over the course of his career. He's an electronic engineer, and he had a couple that didn't really quote unquote succeed. He closed them, but he found success right around the time I was still in college, and he was in his early 50s at the time. And he wrote up a bunch of things, thank goodness, to share with the family about his life, and I really appreciate that he did that. So someone asked him when he sold his company in 2006 for, I forget now, it wasn't 10 million, but it was more than 1 million. So it was multiple $1 million sale of his small electronic company. And I'm probably not giving it justice in terms of what he did, but this is a quote from his book. He said, "Be prepared to work 7 days a week, live on nothing, get little sleep, and do it all while maintaining a home and a marriage. During the first 2 years of SGB, I worked every single day, including Christmas." And that is the story of many, many founders. The drive, the passion. People call these people all sorts of names because they spend so many hours working. And yes, they're doing it probably for reasons that are very self-motivated. But by golly, it really affects the rest of us when we have the opportunity to work inside of these organizations. So I am pro-corporate. I'm pro-business. I think it's great. I'm also pro-nonprofit. And I think that, we find our place, and all of this is so integrated. So I just wanted to make the statement that I fully respect business, and I respect what my dad was able to do. And he also goes on to say that for years, they took on people as they got contracts. And he and his wife took no salary for 2 years, and they lived on credit cards and their savings. And at one point, his wife said to him, if we don't start making a profit here, I'm going to start looking for a job. So, it's a lot. It's a lot to create a business. And at the end of the day, I think a lot of people on the front lines forget what happened at the outset when that company was coming into creation. So I want to go into these couple of examples of experiences or where I'm talking about the insidious aspects of work, these things that happen but no one talks about, or there's no real good solution, or anytime I actually want to talk to an HR practitioner about how one would navigate in this, they tend to revert to what should have happened. And it's like, well, that's not what happened. That people don't behave so perfectly according to textbook. It's like, how would you have actually handled that situation if you were in it? And again, not about process or documentation, but how does the individual having a tough experience deal with it in the moment? So part of this is reflected in a story I heard on a podcast. It was Esther Perel's podcast. She has one that is called Where Do We Begin? Esther Perel is a psychologist. She works mostly with couples, but she did a few episodes where she was talking to two people who had some kind of work relationship. And it was really interesting. She brought in a couple of strippers for one episode and was having conversation about all sorts of aspects of their work. But at one time with one of them, it came up that she had a day job at one point where she was working in corporate. And she said, if someone said something inappropriate to me, I just had to take it, especially, consider the stereotypical a man much older than her. She's probably a beautiful young woman, just so she couldn't really defend herself or act in a way with agency and empowerment and self-leadership. She just kind of had to take the offensive remark, right? She's like, when I'm on the dance floor and someone's inappropriate, I tell them to fuck off. That is like an appropriate exchange in what is happening between two people. And again, I know it's a very different environment, but it should never be okay for someone to have to just take it when someone is being completely offensive. And again, is the only option to leave and let that behavior continue? we need to challenge this as it's happening. I want to hear from a woman communications expert the most powerful way that woman could have responded in the moment to that man. In the ways that I know of, all I can think of is that she would risk escalation. She would risk being accused of insubordination. There might be some kind of backlash. Like, how could she put her, just like as though the man in this scenario were a bug and she could just, kind of crunch out that, put her thumb on that behavior and make it really clear it's not okay. Again, people are complicated. One comment probably won't fix this guy. And, that's another side point. I am not about quote unquote fixing people. I am about having more of everyone's experience kind of brought to the forefront. And again, it's all about empowerment and self-leadership. So that's just one example of where, again, I don't have answers for this at this point. I want to explore this type of thing. I want to continue to see change on this front. I have seen change. I think we're on the precipice of more change in corporate. We need to just be really clear that behavior is not tolerated, that can't be the only option, that the woman gets out, that she just leaves. The status quo really needs to change on so many things. The second experience is one of my own, the second story that I want to share. I was about 28. It was my first real corporate, quote unquote, job. Again, your boss isn't supposed to behave this way, but it happens anyway, right? I was fresh out of graduate school. I was thrilled to have benefits. I had a huge financial burden of student loans going back to my dad's story. So he was still building the business when I was in this position. I had no financial support from my parents in college or graduate school. And I'm not resentful in the way that you would think about that. It did lead to resentment in other ways in my life, but not resentment towards them. I in no way, shape, or form, they did absolutely what they could for me, and I am very, very aware of that, and I am doing fine. But anyway, at the time, I was like, thank God I have this job. It still wasn't fully covering everything because the student loan debt was so high. So I was in a little bit of I just wasn't that empowered. You're not empowered when you're kind of young and you're learning things and you've got financial stress. Doesn't leave you in a good spot. So the story is one of our favorite patrons inside of this work environment needed some data. My boss really liked this guy and she really wanted to do the work, and she did. She spent several hours working on finding this data point. And she was kind of getting to her wit's end and giving up. She liked to call me by my last name at the time, which was Blowers. She had a thick Rhode Island accent. And she was a really funny woman, actually. But she also, she's human like the rest of us, right? So she declares that she gives up. She goes, Blowers, I give up. See what you can find. I can't do a Rhode Island accent. But anyway, I was eager. I was new. And I was excited to do some work for this guy, our favorite client, right? So I knew that she had looked on a bunch of online tools. Again, it was like the early, maybe it was 99. I don't know, something like that. But a lot of stuff was online at this point. But we did get a newsletter that, and I'm sorry if this is too much detail, but there was a newsletter that came in print like every week, every other week. And I literally went to the kitchen and looked through these things. I went page by page, and I found a little chart. I didn't think it was quite right, but I had it and I kind of did what I did. In the meantime, Steve calls. He calls to find out if we found anything. She comes back into the room while I'm on speaker with this guy. I had already told him I had found the data point. He was thrilled that I found the data point. She comes in announcing that she couldn't find it. Steve couldn't find it. Data doesn't exist. She was way too keen to see data didn't exist. And I hated that. I still hate that. It's very difficult to declare something doesn't exist. Anyway, he tried to save face, didn't really work. She could tell something was up. It got revealed that Linda had found the data point. After we get off the phone with Steve, he says to me a line that I will never forget. She said, "Quit fucking showing me up, Blowers, or I'll can your ass." Now, at the time, I was very vulnerable. It was not a joking time. She was not in a laughing ha-ha type of demeanor when she said that to me. But, the messages in this were that the boss is scary. she's fragile, really, is what she is. But be careful around this woman, right? Don't outdo her. I mean, come on. What am I employed for? Like, not to actually find the data point that someone, or give it to her and I don't know what it is there. I mean, really, the message was, don't perform too strongly. I can't handle that, Blowers. And we'll get into more of this. Again, the themes for future podcasts. Recently I read about anti-mentor behavior, and woman to woman, I think this has happened in the majority of my career. Anti-mentor. I swear I'm going to bring the woman on who speaks about this in her book. But this is definitely an example of that. Our boss is actually able to uphold, raise their people up? Or why this fear of their people actually doing awesome work? Why can't that be a reflection of the boss? And I know that there are people out there saying, well, of course it's a reflection of the boss. But there are a lot of bosses that are in very, very, very fear state, and they're leading people who are in scarcity mindset. And it just fuels this constant, very low vibration experience for people. I want to talk to people who recognize that they had this behavior and have evolved to something different. If you know this of yourself, like if you can reflect back to times earlier in your career where maybe you were not the best boss or coworker or something, and you learned to see it, recognize it, move past it, and are willing to talk about it, that would absolutely be something that I would be thrilled to talk about here. So shifting a little bit from these two experiences that I just shared, we all have our own experience of the bad behavior. Like if 5 other people had the same interaction with the boss that I just described, who knows how they would have taken that, or if it would have really affected them the same way that it affected me. This is, again, it's all very, very complicated. What we bring to the workplace varies a ton. And I'm, again, not a social scientist. I'm just highlighting the fact that we all come with our own set of stuff. A side note here, and if you are a leader and some part of this is an aha for you, like understanding that, my 25-year-old employee, doesn't have a partner, might have student debt. I don't really know, whatever it is. Know that just because it was my experience doesn't mean that it's also the experience of your 25, 26-year-old employee. I think what's more important is recognizing that there could be anything going on with this other person that you are leading that could be influencing their experience of the work environment and their ability to have agency, to express themselves fully, to feel empowered, to really feel like they can contribute within an environment. Ultimately, it'd be fantastic if everyone got resources in order to navigate more effectively. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to happen the best, but again, this podcast is one way that I hope it happens. When you're in the front lines, it can really be easy to feel like you're at the mercy of those above you. And in some ways, of course, they're the ones kind of running the show. But as much as money is poured into executive leadership training and coaching, more needs to actually happen so that all sides of the relationship can communicate and lead themselves and really work towards things in a much better manner. I think most people would recognize that couples in therapy, there's usually a couple sides to this. The couple goes to therapy together, but then they might also go separately. But I don't think that if a couple has identified that they need to work on something, if only one half is working on it, it's probably not going to work very well. And it's just interesting to me that so much of the money and resources get funneled to the top lines within an organization. I think it's appropriate, but I also think that everyone needs tools and that they're not always thought of or given or understood that it could actually help the organization run more effectively. And I haven't even talked about how these insidious things affect productivity and engagement and culture within a space. I mean, we spend most of our time at work. And it's just awful to think that so many people are spending that time in this negative vibration space. In terms of all this time spent at work, I want to go back to Esther Perel for just a minute. She's the one who is the psychotherapist who does Where Shall We Begin podcast. She was also on Dax Shepard's podcast, Armchair Expert. And they were talking about the power of identity. And this has come up in many places where I've been researching and reading over the years. So I'll be more diligent about collecting it and citing back to it. But this idea that more and more we are identifying ourselves through our jobs, and we're looking for that. We're looking for meaning and purpose, and we're doing that through our jobs more than ever. There's some talk out there that, it's the millennials or people, born after a certain date that are more committed to want this from work. And I want to kind of back up from that. I think that most humans at some point in their life have been interested in the meaning of their life or their purpose of their life, and how it was defined or created or that identity was formed has been different. In different eras, it meant different things. And now it's shifted more and more to the workplace. So in that podcast I was referencing with Dax, I actually looked at the transcript and I pasted it here. So I'm going to read it almost verbatim. These are Esther's words. She says, "In the past, your identity was something that was assigned to you. Who you are was defined by where you were born, whose child you were, what milieu you were in, and what trade you're in. You inherited it. It was assigned to you. Your community told you who you are. It gave you your sense of belonging. It gave you the calendar by which you were going to live, the rituals with which you would be born and die. And all your big definitions and all the big decisions were made for you. Today you have to figure it out all on your own. In our Western secularized world, the burdens of the self are such that we have the freedom and the burden of having to define and make up our own identity. In the past, someone else gave you your identity, so there was less guilt and anxiety about what you would create for yourself. In the past, you had plenty of certainty and zero freedom. Now you have massive amount of freedom and massive amount of uncertainty and self-doubt." So Esther calls this kind of like, she's talking very much about your relationships have now taken over in this role of purpose. But I would also say people's jobs have taken over. And she really calls it this relationships as a religion or work as a religion. In the past, religion gave you these things. And now it's your partner, your profession. So we need to be thoughtful about this and careful about this. I've heard so many people say, you should feel valued at work. And I agree with this statement, but we have to be careful. It's paradoxical. There's a spectrum here. And I can't rely on my boss or other people who I would consider my employers for my self-esteem. That's a lot of pressure for my boss, especially when the boss runs a team of people. Can she figure out what each person needs to fill their self-esteem bucket? Everyone needs to be more careful about what it actually means to have value and define it and understand what it would look like for them to know that they have value from their peers and the people that they work with so that they can ask for it. So many people are frustrated in the work environment because they don't feel valued. They don't even know what it looks like. And, the bosses or the CFO would say, hello, that paycheck that you're getting every other week, that means you're valued. And it's like we've gotten so far away from the basics. Like if we had to go back to my dad when he was 53 and has working constantly working, no leisure time, no income. I mean, anyway, there's just so much paradox here. So I've talked about a lot of things today, and there are some common themes around fragile people and fearful humans and folks letting the negative side of their humanness guide them in their behaviors and kind of lead the way in the workplace. And sometimes this happens more than other times, and it can depend on the nature of work, of how easy it is how easy it is to let this dominate the scene. I've been a victim and I've had scarcity mindset for a lot of years, and it's only been through my own, discovery and work on my business and all of the things that I've read over the years and getting out in front of people and knowing what their experiences are that have really helped me to change my mindset. And even as income shifted, maybe 8 years ago, we sent the final check to Sally Mae. And at the same time, my husband and I, things have accelerated. It is true that once you get to a certain point, that everything really starts to level off. And we're in a point now where we can actually build wealth. And I attribute that to having a corporate job. And that's my choice. And I'm not saying it's everyone's choice, but so we're going to talk about the evolution of moving from scarcity, victim, some of these other terms I talked about, like being stuck, feeling reactive, creating excuses, having a lot of judgment, a lot of procrastination, to the upper side of that line, which is really around abundance and clarity and having choice and taking responsibility and acceptance and results. It doesn't happen from outside force. It happens from people having agency and moving within this and being okay with the discomfort. We're going to talk about fearful bosses. We're going to talk about the damaged aspects of people. We all have things that have affected us in our lives. These days the word trauma is used a lot. And I feel like, there's the big T and the little t trauma, because some people have experienced major trauma in their life, but there's a lot of, the insidious things that build up over the years too, that create trauma. And even to some degree, what happened to me when I was 28 with that one boss leaves a mark, and how do we kind of solve for that or work outside of that and not feel so vulnerable when something similar like that happens in the future. We still have chauvinism in the workplace in a huge way, a lot of lack of awareness. In the last several weeks, going through my brain, my Catholic upbringing, that Jesus on the cross said, God, forgive them, they know not what they do, right? And so much of this is just around awareness. And that is just ringing through my head. I don't even have to almost consciously know it anymore. When I know that someone is completely unaware, it helps me to forgive. But now I am so like, how do I make them aware in like a kind human way? I don't want to be an asshole to these people, but I want them to be aware of how their behavior could be damaging other humans. Again, this is a forum for this. I want to shed light. I want to provide tools. I want to empower people. And I want to laugh and cry at the absurdity. There's so much absurdity. I want to be able to laugh at it. There's so much fodder for comedy in all of this. And we know that because of shows like The Office and movies like Office Space. All that shit still happens and it's hilarious. I get more and more enjoyment out of watching these shows the older I get and the more experiences I have in the workplace. I am all about pointing the way towards growth, creativity, human potential realized, fulfillment, and satisfaction, even when at the end of the day, sometimes monotonous work has to be done, tedious work has to get completed. People have got to keep it all together for the rest of the organization. That's what functional groups are often doing. They're kind of like, I often, like in my mind's eye, I see these functional teams with their arms like underneath and trying to hold up all of the people in the rest of the organization, like making sure everyone gets paid, making sure that, invoices are paid to our vendors, making, all of the shit that has to kind of stay together so that the wheels stay on the bus. That I want to support. I want to support the people that are supporting the organizations. So stay tuned for future episodes. And again, if you have a story that you think kind of fits in here, especially if you've got perspective and reflective juices that have helped you to see your own evolution or the evolution of someone else over time within their career, any insights, well, Linda, you said this, but in my experience, that, totally cool. Record a voice message and email it to me. It's linda@workdopepod.com. So work and then DOPE and then pod.com. Thanks. See you next time. There you have it. Episode 1 is in the books. I wanted to leave you with some references here. These are some of the mentions throughout the episode in case you want to dig further or look someone up. I mentioned Brené Brown's recent book, and the title of it is Atlas of the Heart. I also mentioned the concept of anti-mentor. And the person who I read about that with was Eliza Van Cort, so VanCort. And the book that I read was A Woman's Guide to Claiming Space. I also mentioned Adam Grant. He is an organizational psychologist. He's a professor at Wharton. He's an author, and he has a fantastic podcast called Work Life. I mentioned Esther Perel, and she has a podcast called Where Do We Begin? And I, of course, mentioned Dax Shepard, I think a couple different times, and his podcast is Armchair Expert. I also want to remind you, if you have any stories, egregious things that have happened over the years in your workspace, things that you witnessed, things that happened to you, you can record that on some kind of recording app on your phone and then send the recording to me at linda@workdopepod.com. I may have you sign something so that I can share it on the podcast. So there might be a little bit of back and forth on that because I do want to use these recordings as something that can be shared and talked about further in this forum. Until next time, signing off. Bye.